The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 10th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And Jesus said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and that their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
How many of us have cried out to God or lifted up prayer after prayer and felt as though God was simply nowhere to be found? Anyone? I assume that this is a problem that many of us and many people around the world face, which is why Job's story speaks so deeply to us. You know, Job, this man who is described as being blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil, a man who faced some of the worst that we feel this world could throw at us: the loss of all his possessions, the death of all his children, physical ailments that utterly incapacitated him. And then in the midst of all of his grief and his suffering, 3 of his closest friends arrive to join Job and to sit with him in his grief. Unfortunately, though, those same 3 friends spend most of the rest of the book condemning Job for obviously doing something wrong and deserving this punishment from God. And Job spends his time rebuking his friends for even thinking such a thing and crying out to God for answers to know why this would have happened to him, and pleading for God's mercy and begging for God to bring a fair judgment upon him. For 37 chapters in the book of Job, Job and these 3 friends seem to just drone on and on and on about the situation that Job has found himself in. It's always the men who claim women talk too much. But after all of this happened, finally, when Job probably thought there was no hope left, God responds. And what we heard in that first reading is where God begins to respond to Job. But did you notice anything about that reading? Or about what God said? I mean, God didn't really answer Job's questions, or God didn't respond to Job's request for a fair trial. God responded to Job with questions. Yes! I'm not the only one who does it. God even told Job that this was what God was doing. God said, "I will question you, and you shall declare to me." And then proceeds on with this long string of questions for Job. And we're looking at this reading and God's response going, why? Why can't God simply answer Job's question? Why can't God answer our questions? Why won't God answer our questions? Because here we have Job asking some very honest questions of God throughout the book. Questions that we would or probably have asked ourselves. Why would this happen to me? Why would you let this happen to me? How could my friends be so accusing and unhelpful in this situation? Doesn't my faithfulness mean anything to what happens to me? Can't I plead my case to you, O God? And again, God responds, not to answer Job's questions of why, but with God's own questions that help to declare Job's place in the midst of God's great creation. We heard those questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who determined its measurements? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? And this response from God goes on for verse after verse for 2 more chapters, showing Job just the grandness of this world and the power God has as creator of it all. And suddenly Job, and hopefully all of us, begin to realize that our questions and our concerns and our quandaries are minuscule in this grand scheme of things. Do you think that will be a comfort for Job? To know that his concerns are incredibly minor in the grand scheme of this world? Do you think Job will get caught up in the wonder of God's creation and just suddenly forget about his sores and his losses? I mean, will we start to see the insignificance of our questions and instead turn our trust to the God who is the creator of all beings? Or is that also not the point? I said it last week and I'll say it again now. This story is not here to tell you that your pain and your grief and your struggles are of no concern to God. That is not what God is telling Job. That is not the message for us today. God still hears our cries, just as God heard Job's cries. God still responds to our prayers and does offer mercy when we are in need of it, just as God does for Job. But what we are to learn through Job, what we are reminded of in our struggles, is that there's something much bigger going on around us. And it's not just about us. So I know I've told this story before to you all, but the experience is still as clear to me now as it was when it happened 6 or 7 years ago when I was in Texas and on internship, and I was working at this church, and it was one of those hectic weeks, you know. Lots to do, lots of errands to run, lots of things that we were trying to pull together at the church. I'm sure you've all been there. And so there I was coming out of a store. I was walking back to my truck with my head down. I was thinking about the next thing I had to do and the next thing, a place I needed to go. And all of a sudden, this gust of wind just caught me. And it literally stopped me in my tracks. It's never happened before. I just literally stopped in the middle of a parking lot. I still remember it plain as day because when I stopped right there, I looked up. And I saw that blue sky with the sun shining that I'd forgotten about. And I saw the mountain range of the hill country sticking up as far as the eye can see, which to that point I didn't know existed right there in my neighborhood. And I stood there, taking in the glory of God. In that moment, suddenly it was not about me and my to-do lists and my errands and my this and my that. It was about something else that was going on around me. It was God's incredible creation that was surrounding me that I had forgotten about. But as I stood there, the car that I had stopped in front of in the midst of this was still waiting for me to move. So it didn't take me long to get back into my head and back into my direction of all the tasks that I had at hand, but it was a reminder for me to simply look up and see what's going on around us in those moments where we feel like we can't. After God speaks to Job, Job finally has his chance to respond back to God. Remember, we heard for all those chapters that Job talked about all of those things that he was going to confront God with whenever God finally decided to respond to Job. Job was ready. Job had his game, And after hearing what God said to him, Job's response in chapter 40 was simple. I'm of small account. What can I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, I will not answer, twice, but will proceed no further. Job's response is that he can't respond. He is so overwhelmed with God's presence and God's appearance that he simply has to sit in awe of the fact that God indeed did show up. And unlike Job's friends who were rebuking Job for what he had supposedly done to earn this punishment, and who were rebuking him for what they considered threats to God, God wasn't there to rebuke Job for that anger. God was not there to rebuke Job for the threats of what Job promised to tell God. God arrived to comfort Job. And it may not sound like that, but this speech from God, filled with all the questions there are, was meant to open Job's eyes to show him his place, which should bring us a measure of comfort, wouldn't you think? After Job's response, then, of not being able to respond, the Lord again speaks about this world and how Job is a part of it. And at the end of this speech, Job responds one final time. And this is what he says. He says, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. Job makes a confession of his lack of understanding in the face of God's power. And then Job announces the news that he had hoped for this whole time. He has seen the Lord. When we are stuck with our questions of why there's suffering or why we are suffering, we learn that God does not provide those answers to why. But what God does do is shows up and begs us to explore what we have learned and experienced about God while we were sitting in our own heap of ashes. God is calling us, just as God called Job, to take stock of our perspective in this world, or on this world. I recently heard a story about from a woman who lives in South Africa, where they were experiencing one of the worst droughts in recent memory. And this woman told this story about how she and some friends gathered together one day. It was in the midst of the drought, but unrelated, to come together and have a feast outside, all together. And just as they sat down and began to eat, it started to rain. Finally, something that hadn't done in months, something that they had been hoping for and praying for, the rain had finally come. And as soon as it did start raining, she said a group of people who were at this table immediately wanted to pack up their things and go inside to eat. They didn't want to get wet. They didn't want to get their food to have to be all soggy, but there was the rest of the table who wanted to sit there in the rain, eating their food, celebrating and giving thanks to God for the relief that had finally come. It made me think that we have gotten to this point that even when God does show up, we get annoyed when it's not on our schedule. or when it ruins our picnic, or when we don't understand why or the timing of things. That is why God shows us a different perspective of how we can see God working in this world. God brings us this word of hope that this suffering is not the end. God points us to the hope of what is to come, to the hope of a new life that is to come. And so thanks be to God that we are not alone in our suffering, that we can know that God and this world are bigger than we can even imagine, and that God shows us that something more is indeed yet to come. Amen.